Could one bad movie actually kill a studio? Not slow it down, not hurt its reputation, completely destroy it, erase it from existence. These 15 films didn't just fail at the box office. They incinerated hundreds of millions of dollars, collapsed entire divisions, ended careers overnight, and left some of Hollywood's most powerful men begging for survival. And the terrifying part? Every single one of them believed they had a guaranteed hit. One of these studios never came back. After Earth, 2013. Will Smith was the most bankable star on the planet. His son Jaden was being groomed as Hollywood's next generational talent. Night Shyamalan, despite a rough patch, still carried the weight of The Sixth Sense behind his name. Sony handed them $130 million and a post-apocalyptic survival story set on an abandoned, hostile Earth. The film lost over $100 million and effectively ended Shyamalan's relationship with major studio filmmaking for years. But the real damage was invisible and far more personal. Will Smith, for the first time in 2 decades, became box office poison overnight. A man who had opened Hitch, Ali, and I Am Legend on the strength of pure star power alone could no longer guarantee an audience. One film restructured how Hollywood calculated his value. And underneath all the spectacle, the reason is painfully simple. Audiences sensed immediately that this wasn't a film built for them. It was a vehicle built for a father to elevate his son. That intention, however loving, replaced story with agenda. And an audience will forgive almost anything except feeling used. Aeon Flux, 2005. Paramount and MTV Films looked at the future and thought, we have the next billion-dollar franchise. They spent over $100 million on production and massive marketing campaigns to build a dystopian world with an Oscar-winning star. But they forgot the golden rule of adaptation. You must respect the original DNA. The animated series was weird, surreal, and absolutely brilliant. The movie? A hollow, confusing mess that stripped away everything that made the brand special in the first place. It made only $52 million at the global box office. But the real tragedy is not just the money. This disaster completely killed MTV Films' theatrical ambitions for an entire decade. They tried to step into the big leagues of blockbuster sci-fi and got crushed by the heavyweights. They learned the hard way that a cool concept and a famous actor are never enough. You cannot buy a franchise. You must earn it. When you take a beloved niche property and water it down to please everybody, you end up pleasing nobody. The loyal fans stay home, the general audience is confused, and the studio executives lose their power. Always respect the soul of your product. Stealth, 2005. Sony had a summer blockbuster formula, and they followed it without deviation. Josh Lucas, Jessica Biel, Jamie Foxx. A rogue AI fighter jet. $135 million. Every ingredient of a guaranteed hit, assembled with such mechanical confidence that nobody stopped to ask whether the story underneath was actually worth telling. It wasn't. Stealth made $32 million worldwide and became one of the most complete commercial disasters in Sony's history. Critics treated it as a joke. Audiences didn't even show up to disagree. But here is what makes Stealth genuinely instructive rather than simply embarrassing. It failed because it was assembled rather than created. Every decision was a calculation: cast a rising star, cast a proven name, add an AI villain because AI is topical, set it in the military because that demographic buys tickets. The result was a film that felt exactly like what it was. A spreadsheet that had learned to move. Audiences are remarkably sophisticated sensors of authenticity. They cannot always explain why something feels hollow, but they feel it within minutes, and then they tell their friends. Sony heard about it for years. The Adventures of Pluto Nash, 2002. Eddie Murphy. A $100 million budget. A sci-fi comedy set in space. Warner Brothers thought they had a formula. What they got was one of the most humiliating opening weekends in Hollywood history. $4.4 million. Against a 9-figure budget. The studio had everything: a globally recognized star, a high-concept premise, and enough money to build a small moon. But they forgot the one thing that cannot be faked, bought, or CGI'd into existence: genuine laughs. This was a comedy, with no comedy in it. Not occasionally flat, not inconsistently funny. Completely, structurally, devastatingly unfunny. And when an audience pays to laugh and sits in silence for 2 hours, they don't just leave disappointed, they warn everyone they know. Word of mouth was lethal within 48 hours. The film grossed $7 million total, against $100 million spent. It is still, to this day, studied as a cautionary tale in film schools. The lesson is ruthless in its simplicity. Know what your product is supposed to deliver, and deliver it. Warner Brothers promised laughter. They delivered an expensive void. Cowboys and Aliens, 2011. Two genres, two legends, one catastrophic miscalculation. Universal and DreamWorks paired Harrison Ford and Daniel Craig, handed Jon Favreau $160 million, and built a marketing campaign around a premise so bold it seemed impossible to ignore. Cowboys versus Aliens. It lost $100 million, because a premise is not a story. Mashing two things that work separately does not guarantee something that works together. The audience walked in unsure whether to feel tension, nostalgia, humor, or awe, and the film couldn't decide either. That identity crisis played out across every scene. When a product doesn't know what it is, the customer doesn't know why they need it. The film sat between every possible audience, too strange for Western fans, too slow for sci-fi fans, too serious for blockbuster fans. It belonged nowhere. And in Hollywood, belonging nowhere means earning nothing. $160 million in, $98 million back. The gap between those two numbers is the exact cost of confusing your audience. Clarity is not a creative compromise. Clarity is the product itself. Nobody told that to the boardroom, and the boardroom paid for the silence. The Postman, 1997. Kevin Costner had an Oscar. He had the credibility of Dances with Wolves. He had Warner Bros. Backing, and a vision so consuming it couldn't be questioned, at least not by anyone in the room. That was the problem. He directed, starred in, and personally championed a nearly 3-hour post-apocalyptic epic that he was absolutely convinced the world was waiting for. The world wasn't waiting. Warner Brothers lost over $100 million. Critics were brutal. Audiences stayed home. But the financial damage was almost secondary to what this film did to Costner's career. His credibility as a director, built painstakingly over years, evaporated in a single opening weekend. He never directed another major studio film again. One decision, one blind spot, one room where nobody said stop. That is the real story of The Postman. Not the budget, not the runtime, the absence of a single honest voice in the entire production. Ambition without accountability is not vision, it's a controlled demolition. The market stepped in and pulled the lever. It always does, eventually, when the people inside the room stop telling the truth. Jupiter Ascending, 2015. The Wachowskis built The Matrix. That should have been an unbreakable foundation of audience trust. Warner Bros. Handed them $176 million and complete creative freedom, and what came back was a film so dense with alien mythology, royal bloodlines, intergalactic bureaucracy, and layered world-building that audiences simply gave up trying to follow it. The film lost over $100 million. And the tragedy here is genuine because the ambition was real. The Wachowskis weren't lazy. They weren't cynical. They built an entire universe with internal logic, visual grandeur, and genuine creative passion. But they forgot to build sense, the bridge that takes an ordinary person sitting in a dark theater and walks them, gently and clearly, into a world they've never seen. Without that bridge, no matter how magnificent the destination, the audience stays where they are. Complexity is not depth. A product that requires its customer to do homework before they can enjoy it is not a product, it's a barrier. And the audience, confronted with that barrier on a Friday night, chose the exit. Jupiter Ascending didn't fail because the ideas were bad. It failed because the filmmakers trusted the ideas more than they trusted the audience. That is always, without exception, a fatal miscalculation. You can be right about everything and still lose everyone. Mortal Engines, 2018. Peter Jackson's name was on this film. The director of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, the man who turned an impossible book into one of the greatest cinematic achievements in history, was producing Mortal Engines. Universal was distributing. The concept was extraordinary. Massive predatory cities on mechanical tracks, hunting smaller cities across a post-apocalyptic wasteland. The production design was jaw-dropping. The scale was unlike anything attempted. They spent over $100 million and walked away with one of the most devastating box office collapses of the decade. Because they built the world and forgot to populate it with people worth caring about. The characters were thin. The emotional stakes were invisible. The spectacle was relentless and completely hollow. And this is a lesson Hollywood has been taught repeatedly, across decades and billions of dollars, and somehow keeps forgetting. You cannot make an audience feel something for a world. You can only make them feel something for a person inside that world. Mortal Engines gave them a breathtaking world and cardboard people. The audience looked at the screen, saw nothing to hold on to, and let go. Universal lost over $100 million. The film vanished from cultural conversation almost immediately after release. No sequels, no legacy, just a stunning, expensive, empty house that nobody wanted to live in. Tomorrowland, 2015. Brad Bird directed The Incredibles. He directed Ratatouille. He directed Mission Impossible: Ghost Protocol. He is, by almost any measure, one of the most gifted filmmakers working in Hollywood. Disney handed him $190 million, and a premise with genuine philosophical weight, a secret utopian dimension, hidden from humanity, accessible only to the most optimistic and visionary minds. The film made $93 million worldwide. Disney lost over $120 million. And the painful truth about Tomorrowland is that it failed not from lack of talent, but from lack of focus. The story couldn't decide who it was speaking to. Children found it too abstract and slow. Adults found it too simplistic and naive. It was positioned perfectly to be rejected by every possible audience simultaneously, and it was. There is a fundamental difference between a great idea and a great film. A great idea is the beginning of a conversation. A great film is a complete experience that delivers emotional value to a specific person at a specific moment. Tomorrowland was a great idea that never became a complete experience. Disney paid $120 million to learn that distinction. Brad Bird, one of the most talented directors alive, was not immune to it. Talent does not protect you from a story that doesn't know what it's trying to say. Only clarity does that. And Tomorrowland never found it. Madam Web, 2024. Sony had a plan. For years, they had been constructing a Spider-Man-adjacent universe, a constellation of spin-offs, built around characters connected to Spider-Man, without Spider-Man himself. Venom had worked, against all expectations. Morbius had not. And then came Madam Web, the film that was supposed to stabilize the strategy and prove the concept had a future. It lost over $100 million and became something far more dangerous than a flop. It became a cultural event of failure. Within 24 hours of release, the internet had turned Madam Web into a punchline so precise and so merciless that it spread faster than any marketing campaign Sony could have constructed. Memes, compilations, out-of-context clips. The failure itself became the most watched content the film ever produced. And that specific kind of public humiliation doesn't just end one movie. It poisons the entire ecosystem around it. Sony's broader spin-off universe plans collapsed almost immediately. Projects were shelved. Strategies were abandoned. One film, through sheer spectacular failure, dismantled years of corporate road mapping. The audience that studios depend on most, young, connected, and deeply online, is not passive. They are critics with platforms, and they have zero patience for a product that treats their intelligence as irrelevant. You cannot feed them something hollow and expect silence. You will get the opposite. Sony got the opposite. Dark Phoenix, 2019. 20 years. Fox spent 20 years building the X-Men franchise, nurturing it through sequels, prequels, timelines that contradicted each other, but somehow kept audiences returning. It was one of the longest-running superhero franchises in history. And Dark Phoenix ended it completely, permanently, and without dignity. The film lost $100 million and killed the franchise in a single weekend. But here is the detail that makes this entry uniquely devastating. They had already made this story before. X-Men, The Last Stand in 2006, attempted the Dark Phoenix arc and failed critically and commercially. Fox looked at that failure, waited 13 years, and decided to try the exact same story again, with a depleted cast, an exhausted audience, and zero new perspective on the material. The result was not just another failure. It was a confirmation of institutional creative bankruptcy. When you run out of ideas, you do not reach backwards into your own catalog of mistakes and repeat them. You find new ground, or you admit you are finished. Fox did neither. They repeated their worst chapter and expected the audience to forget they'd seen it before. The audience remembered everything. They remembered the first failure, they sensed the desperation behind the second attempt, and they stayed home. The franchise that had survived Halle Berry's Mohawk and timeline paradoxes could not survive its own studio's refusal to evolve. Green Lantern, 2011. Ryan Reynolds was one of Hollywood's most charming leading men. The Green Lantern character had decades of devoted comic book fans behind him. Warner Brothers had $200 million, state-of-the-art visual effects technology, and what appeared to be a blueprint for DC's answer to Iron Man. The film made $220 million globally, which sounds almost acceptable until you factor in marketing, distribution, and the brutal mathematics of Hollywood accounting. The real loss exceeded $100 million, but the financial wound was almost secondary to the structural damage. Green Lantern didn't just fail, it poisoned the DC Extended Universe before it could take its first breath. For years afterward, every DC announcement was met with a reference to Green Lantern as evidence that Warner Brothers fundamentally didn't understand its own characters. One film created a decade of institutional distrust that the studio spent hundreds of millions of dollars trying to repair. Ryan Reynolds eventually became Deadpool, a superhero who spent significant screen time mocking the Green Lantern suit. The joke landed because the pain was real. The suit was wrong. The CGI was wrong. The tone was wrong. But underneath all of it, the story was wrong first. Every other failure flows from that one. When the foundation is hollow, no amount of technology, star power, or marketing budget can hold the structure up. The audience sees through the screen every single time. Valerian and the City of a Thousand Planets, 2017. Luc Besson is not an amateur chasing a dream. He directed La Femme Nikita. He gave the world the fifth element, a film so visually and tonally singular that it developed a cult following that has lasted 30 years. He is a genuinely original cinematic voice with a proven track record. And he put all of it on the line for Valerian. His own money, his company's future, his creative reputation. $200 million, the most expensive European production in history at the time. The film made $225 million worldwide, a number that sounds close until you account for the full cost of global marketing and distribution. EuropaCorp lost well over $100 million. The company nearly collapsed entirely. Besson was eventually forced to cede operational control of the studio he had built, from nothing a creative independent, stripped of his independence by a single film that was too expensive for the market to absorb. The visuals were extraordinary. The world-building was genuinely inventive. And none of it was enough. Because here is the brutal arithmetic of the film business. It doesn't matter how beautiful your creation is, if the audience it reaches cannot sustain the cost of making it. Besson built the most ambitious boat of his career. He just built it for a river that wasn't wide enough. Even masters drown when the water is wrong. Mars Needs Moms, 2011. Disney believed the technology had finally arrived. Robert Zemeckis had spent years pioneering performance capture animation, The Polar Express, Beowulf, A Christmas Carol, and the results were increasingly sophisticated. Disney invested $150 million in Mars Needs Moms, convinced that digital humans had crossed the threshold from unsettling to convincing. They hadn't. The film made $39 million worldwide. Disney lost $140 million and immediately shut down Image Movers Digital, the entire production studio responsible for the film the following year. The division was gone within months of the film's release. But the financial catastrophe points to something deeper than a bad investment. Disney had misunderstood the fundamental contract between animated films and their audience. Children do not attend animated movies to witness technological achievement. They go to feel something, to laugh, to cry, to be scared and then comforted. A digitally rendered face that looks almost human, but moves in ways that feel subtly wrong, doesn't create warmth. It creates unease. Neuroscientists have a name for it. The uncanny valley, that specific region of near-human resemblance that triggers discomfort rather than connection. Disney walked $150 million directly into it. The story itself had genuine heart. The emotional intent was real. But the faces delivering that emotion were wrong in ways the audience couldn't articulate but couldn't ignore. In storytelling, the face is the final frontier. Disney discovered that the hard way. Titan AE 2000. Don Bluth was the animator who gave the world The Secret of Nim and An American Tail. Gary Goldman was his longtime creative partner. Together they had a track record of producing animated films that genuinely moved people. Fox gave them $75 million, a cast including Matt Damon and Drew Barrymore, and a post-apocalyptic space epic that blended hand-drawn animation with cutting-edge CGI in ways that were technically breathtaking. The film made $22 million. Fox shut down its entire animation division as a direct consequence. But Titan AE is perhaps the most genuinely tragic entry on this list, because the film didn't fail because it was bad. It failed because it existed in a space that no audience could find. The story was too dark, too violent, and too emotionally complex for young children. But the animated format made adult audiences automatically dismiss it as a children's film before they'd seen a single frame. It was a masterwork positioned in a blind spot too mature for its assumed audience, invisible to its actual one. Fox built something genuinely remarkable and placed it somewhere nobody was looking. The most dangerous position in any market is the gap between two audiences close enough to both to seem relevant, too far from each to be chosen. Titan AE found that gap with devastating precision, and Fox paid with an entire studio. John Carter, 2012. The source material that became John Carter predates Superman. It predates Flash Gordon. Edgar Rice Burroughs published A Princess of Mars in 1912, and those stories directly inspired virtually every major science fiction franchise of the 20th century. Star Wars, Avatar, Dune. The DNA of John Carter runs through all of them. Disney acquired the rights, handed the project to Andrew Stanton, a man with two of the most beloved films in Pixar's history on his resume, gave him $250 million, and watched it collapse. Disney lost $200 million. It remains one of the single largest financial losses in Hollywood history. The title itself is a case study in institutional failure. The original name, A Princess of Mars, was stripped away because the studio feared the word princess would repel male audiences, and Mars would repel everyone else. What remained was the name of a man nobody had ever heard of. A century of iconic, beloved, deeply influential source material, reduced to a name that communicated absolutely nothing to any audience on Earth. The film wasn't the problem. The film was actually watchable. The marketing was the murder weapon. When a studio loses confidence in its own story and strips away everything that made it special in the pursuit of broad appeal, it ends up with nothing specific enough to appeal to anyone. Disney learned that at a cost of $200 million. Battlefield Earth, 2000. This is not simply the story of a film that failed. This is the story of what happens when a celebrity's personal ideology is allowed to become a studio's business plan, and the studio pays for it with its existence. John Travolta had spent over a decade trying to bring Battlefield Earth to the screen. The source material was a novel by Ron Hubbard, the founder of Scientology, of which Travolta is a prominent member. He finally secured production through Franchise Pictures. The film lost so catastrophically that it didn't just generate bad reviews, it triggered a fraud lawsuit so severe that Franchise Pictures was bankrupted and dissolved. The studio ceased to exist. Battlefield Earth also did something rare among financial disasters. It achieved a kind of legendary, permanent infamy. It swept the Razzie Awards. It became required viewing in film criticism courses as a study in what not to do. Nearly every major publication that covers cinema has placed it on a worst-ever list at some point in the last 2 decades. The lesson here goes far beyond filmmaking. It is a lesson about the relationship between personal obsession and professional judgment. When the driving force behind a $73 million production is one person's private devotion rather than a shared creative vision built for an audience, the audience senses it immediately. They sense the vanity behind the camera, and they punish it without mercy. Final Fantasy, The Spirits Within, 2001. Square was not a struggling independent trying to prove something. They were the creators of one of the most successful video game franchises in history, a brand with tens of millions of devoted fans across the world. They had the resources, the talent, and the cultural credibility to make almost anything, and they chose to make a completely original science fiction film, not connected to any beloved Final Fantasy story, not featuring any character their fans had spent hundreds of hours with, built entirely on the promise that photorealistic CGI humans could carry a feature film on their own. They spent $137 million. They made $85 million. Square was forced to sell its film division and merge with Enix just to remain solvent. The technology was not the failure. The visuals were genuinely revolutionary. Critics who despised the film acknowledged that what Square had achieved technically was unlike anything previously attempted in cinema. The CGI worked, and the film still failed completely, irreversibly, institutionally, because the characters were cold, the story was distant, and there was nothing human at the center of it to hold the audience. The machine was flawless, the soul was absent, and that is the defining lesson of this entire list. Across 15 films, 15 studios, and billions of dollars in combined losses, the answer is always the same. Audiences do not come for technology, spectacle, budgets, or brand names. They come for something true. Give them anything else, and they will always, without exception, leave. Every single studio on this list had money. They had talent. They had technology that should have guaranteed success. And they still lost because they forgot the only thing that has ever mattered in storytelling: the audience. Not the budget, not the effects, not the franchise name. The person sitting in the dark, deciding whether to care. If this video made you think differently about the films you watch, you already know what to do.